TS Underswap is a fan game that's presented many mysteries about its story, but what may be the most mysterious element in it so far is Frisk and their role in the game. Considering the character they swap with in this fan game is Kara, who is already extremely enigmatic even in Undertale, this isn't too surprising. But TS Underswap has thrown a new layer of ambiguity into the mix for Frisk that Undertale never had for Kara, and that revolves around who Frisk actually is now in TS Underswap. There's many more potential candidates for Frisk's identity, with the introduction of the 7 Temmies and Flowey, and although many people have assumed their identity to be the mysterious force pushing Kara to proceed, there isn't any clear-cut association between it and Frisk. In general, I think a big issue with discourse for TS Underswap Frisk is that a lot of people have already assumed who Frisk is, when the truth is that with the extremely sparse information we have currently, it's just impossible to determine who Frisk is. Now, of course, while Frisk's identity is something that we probably won't learn about until the release of future demos, that doesn't mean I think there's no point in speculation. Through speculation, we can ensure that when future demos do release, we can use the currently available information to be on the lookout for evidence that either supports or disproves the current theories we have for Frisk's identity. So with this video, I aim to present all of the major theories on Frisk's identity, and examine each of them to see if there's any support to those theories, and ultimately give my predictions on what I believe is most likely. Now before this video devolves into pure speculation for all of the TS Underswap Frisk theories, I think it's important to cover our bases and go over everything we actually know about Frisk before getting to the theories. Not only do I think these details can help us give us a better frame of reference for who Frisk may be in the present, but I also think these details can help us form a better picture about what they may actually be like, even if the information that we have on Frisk is extremely limited, as I said before. The first instance we get to learn any information about Frisk is in their first and only appearance in the opening tale of the game, where Frisk falls into the mountain in 21X. An interesting detail about this opening cutscene, which is easy to overlook, is that we actually have an explicit reason for Frisk falling into the mountain, which is that Frisk sought shelter from a rainy day and thus fell down. This detail about Frisk's fall seems to be directly taken from Undertale's Kickstarter, with it saying the same thing about the human's fall. But beyond just being a reference, this detail does imply that Frisk's fall was entirely accidental, which is very different from how Kara's fall in Undertale is implied to have been deliberate on their part. The next indication about Frisk's character is something you can get immediately after the opening cutscene. If you enter Frisk or MK's name into the title screen, the game won't allow you to choose their names because it belongs to the Fallen. At a surface level, this name seems to just confirm that Frisk and MK have died, although it could also be alluding to either Frisk or MK having fallen down with an illness in a similar way as Kara did in Undertale. Although I would also find it really funny if the Fallen for MK was meant to reference how they constantly trip over themselves. There are also other definitions for the title of the Fallen, with the Fallen also being used to refer to soldiers that have died in battle. And while I don't think Frisk or MK were exactly soldiers for monster kind, I could see this alluding to Frisk and MK dying in a somewhat similar way to Kara and Asriel in Undertale, with them dying during some battle to the humans. The title of the Fallen also has other meanings associated with it, but we'll get back to that later in this video. The last direct indicator of Frisk's existence in TS Underswap is the traces of them we find in Asgore's home. In Asgore's home, we can see a picture of them with the Dreamers. Asgore himself also mentions that Kara's eyes shined with a similar hope to Frisk, although this is a detail that is present in Undertale as well. The only other potential indicator of their existence within TS Underswap itself that I'm aware of is an interesting detail with the running boots. In a specific interaction with the running boots, you'll actually get some text saying there's a name engraved at the bottom of the boots, but we unfortunately cannot see it due to the name being faded. Now, this isn't a concrete association with Frisk, since these boots could belong to a lot of people, but considering that they come from Asgore, there's a strong chance that these are hand-me-downs from Frisk that Asgore is giving to Kara. I would personally find it really interesting if these belong to Frisk, because it would associate them with the idea of moving forward or progression in a broader sense, because the running boots is an item that lets you move around faster. Now that's all we have for information surrounding Frisk within TS Underswap itself. However, there's also additional paratextual evidence for Frisk in another project Team Switch has worked on. The project I'm referring to is AAA Underswap. which admittedly is just a massive shitpost project. But despite its canonicity being extremely uncertain to say the least, there's a scene in particular that I find very interesting. In one of the scenes of the game, Asgore is telling an old tale to Kara, which was written by Asgore's children. In this tale, Frisk and MK end up discovering magical flowers which grant them superpowers, allowing them to break the barrier and free monster kind. The story is very childish, but it's surprisingly believable of how it fits Frisk and MK's character, especially since MK is implied to have drawn comics in TS Underswap, which we can see in Asgore's home. Now, outside of any of Teen Switch's actual games, we have received a few authorial statements that provide us more information on Frisk's character. One of these revealed that Frisk's personality, just like all of the other characters in TS Underswap, will be based on the hints to their personality that we see in their interactions in Undertale, and this will probably include things like their acts during battle. We also know that TS Underswap will apparently take creative liberties with Frisk's character, which makes sense considering that their personality is deliberately left largely ambiguous in Undertale. Another important detail which may potentially play a part in the Rufus route is that Frisk will apparently not be a, quote, demon child. And other statements have shown that they don't plan to portray Frisk and Kara to have a one-dimensional, dichotomous contrast of pure good and evil. And lastly, we've also learned that Frisk will apparently share very similar relevance to Kara in Undertale, albeit possibly being a little less important. It is important to keep in mind that some of these developer statements date back to years ago, so some of the information here may be outdated. But overall, I do believe they give us a better grasp on how Frisk will be handled in TS Underswap. Ultimately, even with the authorial statements, I still think we are lacking far too much information to say anything concrete regarding Frisk and their character. However, I think that all this information can give us a better frame of reference to examine the multitude of TS Underswap Frisk theories from, and to judge what evidence supports or detracts from these theories. Additionally, I also just think it's important for giving us a better picture of how Frisk's general portrayal may be like in the future for TS Underswap. Before we get to the major theories for Frisk though, I'd like to quickly tackle an idea I've seen before, that Frisk is just gone without any extra steps or reincarnation. This theory is just one that, while technically possible, is extremely lame from a narrative standpoint, and developer statements mentioned prior in this video about Frisk's importance go against this notion. This is our 1D tier theory of the video. Now with that quickie theory covered, let's finally get into some of the major theories surrounding Frisk's identity. The most popular theory I've seen regarding Frisk's current identity is definitely that they are the mysterious force that we see throughout the game that's overriding Kara's decisions, who I'll be calling the entity throughout this video. I believe the main reason this theory has become the most prevalent is simply because it just makes sense. TS Underswap is an AU in general where the characters' roles are swapped, even if their personalities stay the same, and the one who was in the role like the entities in Undertale was Kara, who was swapped with Frisk. This explanation has never fully satisfied me personally though, because it primarily relies on evidence from outside of the actual game. Now then, while our information on the entity alone is even less than what we have on Frisk, presuming that Frisk is the entity can give us some interesting potential evidence. For instance, the fact that Asgore states that Kara's eyes shine with a similar hope that Frisk did immediately after the entity has compelled Kara to proceed could point to the entity being Frisk, even if this is a reference to how Asgore says the same line for Kara in Undertale. Something I've seen suggested in my comments for some of my prior videos is that the entity's overridden dialogue is obviously meant to parallel the dialogue options for leaving Toriel's home, which is ostensibly coming from Frisk. Additionally, the entity's general strong determination to move forward is something that could be paralleling Frisk's high amount of determination in Undertale. Now, an interesting idea I haven't seen anyone else mention yet that could be an indicator of Frisk being the entity is actually in the Sans hangout. Early on into the hangout, you'll be prompted with a few dialogue choices for hanging out, and one of them is very cringy for lack of a better term. On its face, it just seems like a quirky bit of dialogue, but interestingly enough, this actually does seem to be paralleling certain dialogue from Undertale. This seems to be paralleling the dialogue choices that are found in Alfie's date that are also coming from Frisk. Now admittedly, this dialogue isn't overridden dialogue, and it's honestly something that would be in character for Kara to say with how much of a troll they are, but I find this parallel to be curious regardless. If this is coming from Frisk, then it could be showing more of the positives of their character, sort of in a similar way that the whimsical narration in Undertale shows the positives of Kara's character. Especially since the entity so far has been framed in an almost exclusively negative light. I think giving Frisk more of a whimsical side could help balance out their character and make them less one-dimensional, which is what one of the developer's statements prior had said, although this is extremely speculative reasoning. As a quick addendum to the script, while I was editing this video, I ended up finding another developer statement about Frisk, saying that the way that they're handling Frisk in TS Underswap is especially cool due to how Kara is the narrator. And this seems to really implicate Frisk being the entity, because it implies that the way Frisk is being handled is cool because Kara is the narrator, which may be referring to the fact that the entity has the overwritten dialogue in place of being the narrator of the game, although the statement can definitely be interpreted in many ways. Aside from those few details, I honestly haven't seen much evidence from an in-universe perspective that shows that the entity and Frisk have many direct associations, and there isn't much directly pointing to it beyond general inferences. I feel something that skews the discussion here is the presumption that there simply is no other candidate who could fill the entity's role. But as I've stated back in my TS Underswap Kara analysis, I believe another likely candidate for the entity's role is the player themselves, which would remove Frisk's character from needing to be the entity. I also don't believe Frisk being the entity is exactly a flawless theory either, because it doesn't fully mesh well with some of the new lore this game has introduced. For example, we know there are 7 Temmies and Flowey, who all seem to be aware of your abilities to save and load, which likely means they're all soulless beings injected with determination. Presuming that Frisk is the entity with this knowledge, we could reason out with educated guesses that one of these beings would be MK, and 6 of the Temmies are commonly speculated to be something we'll get back to later in this video. The issue here is that under this context, either Flowey or one of the Temmies is missing from having an identity with Frisk being the entity, and I doubt any of the Temmie or Floweys are taken up by someone with an unimportant identity. Now, I do believe there are possible explanations for this, but most of them are somewhat contrived, and it dampens the theory's validity a little bit for me. Overall, I think this is an A-tier theory for me. It could definitely fit the game well, but it's probably the most stale theory on this list, and it has some slight inconsistencies that put it down a bit. Besides Frisk being the entity, one of the more prevalent theories I've seen is that Frisk is the Temmie that we see try to take our soul at the start of the game. Before diving into this specific theory, I'd like to ask a natural question that comes from these types of theories, which is it even possible for a human to be reincarnated into soulless beings? We know that Asriel can in Undertale, but we're never provided any information on how this may work for a human. We don't have any concrete explanations at this moment, but TS Underswap has actually made some very interesting expansions to Undertale's lore that seem to imply this possibility. Namely, in the Starlight Isles library, we can read about a book which explains that hypothetically, a living body may be able to live on without a soul, like how a soul is able to live on without its body. This book then goes on to mention how this may be why cremation is a popular method of burial for humans, due to it being the only way to fully ensure that the body is truly dead. This book could just be additional world building, but can also provide an expectation for when this theory will become relevant to the narrative, especially considering how reading this book even has Kara add a question mark next to their soul in the journal. I find the mention of how cremation in the human world is similar to monster funeral rites to also be a noteworthy detail, because it may imply that we'll see the ideas meet eventually. And one of the most common theories for TS Underswap implies we've seen this already, because 6 of the Temmies are commonly speculated to be the other fallen humans. Now, with the basis of this theory established, I'd like to give all the evidence and analysis I could think of for this theory. To start with, the angel anthology that we could find in the Ruthless Root could be potential evidence for this theory. It describes that the angel may possibly be multiple beings, albeit such theories are considered taboo. Considering we find this on the Ruthless Root, which in Undertale had the angel implied to be Kara, this may be referring to the Angel of Death for TS Underswap, which should theoretically still be Frisk, and would thus imply that Frisk is actually the Temmies. Although this may not be strictly referring to the Angel of Death, and rather just the Angel, which would likely be more applicable to MK. Additionally, as I stated previously in this video, Frisk on the naming screen is labeled as the Fallen, and one of the definitions for that term that I omitted earlier in this video is subject to sin or depravity. Considering that each of the Temmie seem to be associated with one of the 7 deadly sins, this could potentially be foreshadowing that Frisk is a Temmie. Although once again, this is equally as applicable to MK. The only other possible piece of evidence I can think of which supports this theory is how the Temmie that tries to steal your soul at the start of the game speaks. It claims that it hasn't had a soul in so long, and while there is a good chance this is just referring to a soul in general, this could be stretched to imply that it hasn't had a human soul in so long with how intense the Temmie's words are stated. Although this conclusion takes a pretty big leap to arrive to. In all honesty, I find that among the theories brought up in this video, this is probably the weakest one, because most of the evidence in favor of it can also be used for MK, and I think the evidence fits them far more than it does Frisk. Overall though, a solid C tier theory. Another theory that I've seen floating around for TS Underswap is that Frisk is actually Flowey, and this is one of the more interesting theories. Before properly getting into this theory though, you may be thinking, shouldn't Azrael still be Flowey? How could Frisk be Flowey? Initially, that's what it seems it should be, especially since Flowey in TS Underswap acts extremely similar to its Undertale counterpart. However, we actually know that this can't be true, because Azrael is still alive in TS Underswap. We can actually see a portion of his sprite in Starstruck Village at Crossbones' booth, and we can also use the cell phone to briefly call him. In general, one of the more interesting parts of this theory actually is Flowey and Azrael's connection, because despite it being impossible for them to be the same person, they certainly know each other. In one of the Tumblr character asks that Flowey received, one of the questions was if it knew the artist of Crossbones' comics, who is Azrael, and Flowey responded by confirming that it knows Azrael, and that you could say that they're best friends. Now, this is all speculation, but these two being so close could definitely come from sharing similar circumstances of them both being children of the royal family. On the topic of the Tumblr ask, there's actually another character ask that is relevant to Flowey. In one of Asgore's character asks, someone asked if he knew Flowey, and while he said that he did not know Flowey, so he'd probably name himself that too if he was a flower. This ask is actually somewhat revealing, because it implies that the name Flowey would be used by someone with a similar naming sense to Asgore, which implies that Flowey would be one of his children primarily. Now then, all this evidence so far implicates Frisk and MK just as much, but I'd like to begin exploring some analysis which would more directly be aimed at Flowey being Frisk, because many of Flowey's scenes can be read in a very interesting way if we posit that Frisk is Flowey. For example, after obtaining the Stargaze memory in the evacuation route, Flowey actually has an extra interaction with Kara. This interaction is largely focused on Flowey telling Kara that they can change, but during this interaction, Flowey will also mention that it's been down this road before. This implies that just like how Flowey is advocating for Kara to change, despite the bad memories that they are remembering, Flowey has also seemingly done so itself, and has unshackled itself from whatever past burdens it carried. Comparing this with what we know of Frisk and Undertale is really interesting, because if Frisk is associated with any two things, it's definitely their determination and individuality. We get to see their determination echo all throughout Undertale at each save point, along with moments where they stand up against Omega Flowey or literally refuse death against Azrael. Frisk's character also has a particular emphasis on the idea of a strong sense of self. For example, the whole major reveal of the pacifist route is that Frisk is in fact their own person, which is a reveal the game weaponizes against you after the fact to discourage you from resetting. There is also the infamous line at the mirror, despite everything, it's still you. In the scene with Flowey in the evacuation route, we can see Flowey emphasizing both of these traits, with the determination showing through Flowey's desire of change, and its individuality being shown through how it's also had to deal with its own past bad memories. Flowey's general association with progression also is noteworthy to bring up here, because it's constantly emphasizing for you to progress onwards, such as how it views the coffin keep as an unnecessary detour, and encourages you to keep progressing, which may connect Flowey more strongly to Frisk considering how determination, as I mentioned earlier, is something Frisk is strongly associated with, along with how TS Underswap Frisk may be associated with the running boots. Another scene that becomes far more interesting under this theory is a specific interaction in the Ruthless route between Flowey and the main Temmie that we see at the start of the game. This Temmie discusses how it's always just followed what the others said, and how it never had Flowey's charisma or confidence. This seems to be implying that Flowey and this Temmie knew each other to a significant extent, potentially in a prior life as Frisk and MK. And with that assumption, I definitely imagine Frisk to be the more confident and charismatic one between the two Dreamer children. especially since MK's character arc in Undertale itself is about their idealistic view of Undyne being faulty. Additionally, MK seems to be more associated with the Temmies than Frisk is, considering that the bedroom in Asgore's home has the Temmie plush. This could technically be either Frisk or MK's room, but considering there's a portrait of MK outside the bedroom, and there are comic book drawings done with someone's mouth, it strongly implied this bedroom and the Temmie plush would belong to MK. The scene would also align with the evacuation route Flowey scene I mentioned earlier, of how Flowey has now become unburdened by its past, with how Flowey seems very unaffected by Temmie's speech by casually sending it flying. On a more unrelated note, I find the thematic contrast between Flowey and Temmie in Tia's Underswap to be extremely interesting. Flowey is shown to have seemingly moved on from its past, and seems unaffected by lingering parts of that past returning, such as Temmie. The main Temmie, on the other hand, seems extremely tied to the past, which we could observe with how it ranted on to Flowey about their self-perceived inferiority, along with how the main Temmie seems desperate to have a soul once again, a longing for what they once had. This is a total opposition to Flowey, because as far as we could tell, it seems to have no interest in your soul, and instead seems more interested in what decisions you make. To focus back on the Fury itself, I actually find Frisk being Flowey to be pretty decent. There's much left to be desired from the actual in-universe logic of how Frisk could come to be Flowey, but looking at some of Flowey's scenes under the assumption that Frisk is Flowey, a lot of Flowey's behaviors connect somewhat to Frisk. Overall, this is an S tier Fury. Now then, the last Fury I want to mention for this video is actually one that was sent to me on Twitter by Renato Magai, and their Fury was something that inspired this video's creation too, so massive credits to them for sending me this. The Fury in question asserts that Frisk is actually this Temmie in a suit that we see at the end of Starlight Isles, who I'll be referring to as Pride Temmie for the rest of this video, because well, it's very prideful. Now all of the evidence for this Fury is actually all in this image, and I want to go through this entire image, because the connections here are extremely interesting to say the least. Let's start on the right side of this image, which starts by pointing out that the one who tells the tale of the monster's history, including Frisk's fall, is actually the Pride Temmie. We can clearly see it at the beginning of the opening cutscene that it is in fact the Pride Temmie that's telling the story, based on the expressionless face, its outfit, and its serious disposition when telling the story. This could imply there's a deeper connection between Frisk and the Pride Temmie. Considering that Undertale itself ended up playing around with this intro cutscene at the end of the True Pacifist route for its final twist, I could definitely see Tia's Underswap repurposing it in a similar way in order to reveal a twist like Frisk's identity. The next part of this Fury to the right points out that the true leader of the Temmie seems to be the Pride Temmie, and we have a few things of the game that points to this. For example, the main Temmie we were expecting to be the leader of the group has suggested that it just follows the orders of the others in the previously mentioned scene they had with Flowey. The Pride Temmie itself seems to be the most proactive in attempting to take the human soul, and compared to the other Temmies so far, it seems to have the most importance narratively besides the main Temmie that we see at the start. The Pride Temmie being the actual leader of this group could be extremely interesting, since their identity would likely be the most important of the group, which could be implicating Frisk, especially with the other evidence this Fury presents. The bottom part of this image is just what we've already gone over prior in this video, regarding the connection MK and Frisk may have to the Temmies, but the top part of this image starts to get into some interesting parallels between Frisk and the Pride Temmie. This part of the Fury draws a parallel between Frisk and the Pride Temmie's expression, with how both are generally expressionless, but in certain scenes where they are being deliberately creepy, they both wear a smile. Once again, this parallel could be a point which connects Frisk and the Pride Temmie. The left side of this image is the part of this Fury that's the most interesting to me though. This Fury presents a connection of one of Frisk's core traits, that being their strong sense of individuality with the pridefulness of this Temmie. Now as I mentioned before in the Flowey section of this video, one of Frisk's defining traits in Undertale is their individuality, which is emphasized in numerous areas in Undertale. This Fury then proposes that the Pride Temmie twist this defining trait of Frisk, with their strong sense of self being warped into a feeling of flat-out superiority over others. Considering that creative liberties are apparently being taken with Frisk's character in Tia's Underswap, Frisk being the Pride Temmie could be a display of how Tia's Underswap is intentionally exaggerating Frisk's main character traits. In addition to this theory, something that I've only briefly alluded to earlier in this video is some speculation I've had about Frisk's identity. In Undertale, one of the biggest twists that the game had in the past Swiss route was that the protagonist you've been playing as is not actually the character you named, but rather was Frisk. If TS Underswap were to have an endgame twist that was similar to this, it couldn't just replicate this twist because we already know who Frisk and Kara are. Frisk's identity may be the reveal that TS Underswap will uphold for its endgame twist, which may explain why TS Underswap has obfuscated who Frisk actually is. If this is true, then it would be best to look for candidates who are less obvious, like Temmie, since Frisk would likely be someone less obvious so that the game could actually do a twist reveal for their identity. Overall, this theory makes surprisingly compelling connections between Frisk and Temmie, an S tier theory. Now then, there are a lot of theories about Frisk that I've yet to discuss, but for the sake of keeping the length of this video reasonable, I think it's best I conclude the video here. To be honest, when I began writing the script for this video, I was sure it wouldn't make it past 9 minutes with just how little information there is on Frisk, but somehow this video got around as long as my last video. I hope that with this video, I was able to provide a better picture of how TS and Underswap may portray Frisk when we see them, and what their current identity may be. If you enjoyed this video, then please consider liking and subscribing to help boost my content in the YouTube algorithm. And if you want to see similar TS Underswap speculation and analysis to this, I'd highly recommend watching this video about a personal TS Underswap theory of mine which aims to analyze the game's meta-narrative. If you have your own theories about Frisk's identity that I failed to include in this video, or you feel there's something I missed with the theories covered here, then feel free to comment on them. But other than that, take care.